Have you ever wondered who's on the $100 bill? Who conducted the famous kite experiment all those years ago? In the inaugural episode of The History of Something, I'll be covering Benjamin Franklin. He was one of the most influential and famous founding fathers of America. I'll give some context so you know where this takes place in history. Benjamin Franklin was born on January 17, 1706 in Boston. At this time, Britain still ruled over the 13 colonies, which you are probably learning about in school. Ben lived during this period, and he was the 14th out of 16 kids his parents had. They were not particularly wealthy. However, he did live in a relatively kind household. It's crazy to think that the 14th child could accomplish such great feats in his life. This episode will be divided into 4 parts. The first is when Ben's a little kid. The second is when he's an apprentice for his brother. The third part is when he's a young adult. And the final part is when he becomes a politician and a founding father. Ben had an immense love for reading, which you will learn about later, and I suggest that anyone who loves this episode should read the Value Tales. This series was inspired by it. My dad used to read these to me when I was younger, and they really catalyzed my love for science and the humanities. But enough of the introduction, let's jump right into the incredible life of Benjamin Franklin. In a not so far away land, not so long ago, lived a bright man who tried his hands at everything that he could, and most importantly, he tried to save everything that he could. His name was Benjamin Franklin. Ben at his father's candle shop when he was younger.
Hello, Father. I cannot see myself working at your candle shop when I'm older. Even though we could only afford to send me to 2 years to Boston Latin, I love to read and would really like to do something in that field. Ben, you could take up a position in church. That is a very respectable position, and you'd get to work with the Bible. I can clearly see that being a candle maker is not the correct path for you. No, Father, I do not think becoming a priest would be something that I'd like to do. Hmm. Well, how about you become an apprentice for your brother James? That way you can get a head start on printing and maybe later do something with books. Very well, Father. I shall do as such.
Back in those days, it was very common for young boys to become apprentices to learn the skills required for certain occupations. In Ben's case, it was taking a printing apprenticeship. There are often 2 sides to a coin, and in Ben's time, apprenticeship could be highly rewarding or highly stressful. As you will see later, the masters of the apprentices were entitled to punish the apprentices in any way they seemed fit. Also, the apprentice had to work for them until they were 21 with little to no pay. They were compensated with room and board and food to eat. Inside of James' apprenticeship shop.
I hate that I have no control over my life. I have no money, no books to read, and the food here is horrible.
Ben started to realize that James did not want to spend any more money than he had to on Ben. So Ben came up with an ingenious idea to make sure that he was able to get some money of his own.
What, Ben? Don't you see that I'm busy? This better be important. Don't you want to save money? How about if you give me half of the money you spend on me for food, but I'll buy what I want with it. The rest you can keep. That way I can eat what I would like and you can save money.
By doing this, Ben was able to get money for himself. Even further, he split what he had into 2 parts. One for the food that he actually needed to eat, and other for books that he wanted to buy. This was his first exposure to the art of saving, and this strategy would massively benefit him in the long run. And Ben no longer had to wait and pay to read books. He could get his hands on as many books as his mind could please.
I love to read and I have to be able to afford a book every time. So what I should do is that I should buy it from the bookshop and then I should sell it for a tad bit higher than what I bought it for. And in that way I'll be able to make a small profit and I won't lose all my money.
As I said earlier, Ben's father was only able to afford to send Ben to 2 years of school, and Ben did not learn how to fully write in those 2 years. Ben took it upon himself to learn how to write by copying pages and pages of books until he could write well. Ben would get inspired by the famous authors who would come to stop by to have their articles published, and because of this, Ben decided that he was going to have his own article. Obviously, he would have to go under an alias, as James would get extremely mad if he found out who was writing his articles. Ben chose a very clever one, Miss Silence Dogood. As time went on, Everyone started to love the articles that Ben would write, and they became a huge hit. Even Ben would love them. He would publish them in his premier paper. After one point, though, Ben was unable to keep the secret from James, and as you would expect, it was not handled well.
James, I have something to tell you. Ben, is it another way to save money? If so, I'm all ears. Unfortunately not. I am Mrs. Silence Do Good. Ben, you have taken advantage of me, and you have tricked me. I'm furious. Don't start thinking that you're any good.
As I said earlier, Ben lived during the colonial days. Back then, masters of the apprentices were able to punish them in whatever way they seemed fit, and for Ben, that included some very harsh punishments. As time went on, James would start punishing Ben for very little incidents, and Ben started to grow increasingly annoyed and angry. Ben started to think that he should run away from his brother James. However, James made it increasingly harder for Ben to do anything, and even warned other printers in the area to watch out if Ben asked them for a job.
Guys, please alert me if Ben tries to come to you, as he is still my apprentice until he turns 21, and it seems that he's getting unhappier by the day. I suspect that he might try to run away.
Ben overheard their conversation, and he was visibly shattered. He was hoping he could stay in Boston, but later he soon realized that there was much more to the world than Boston. Now begins the second chapter in Ben Franklin's life. The inquisitive inventor we know of today takes shape in this second chapter. His characters and morals are already set in stone. I think personally that this part of his life was the most important one, as he did so much in his young adult life. The result is mind-blowing. In this chapter, you will see all the interesting things that he creates and books he writes, setting up for even further, more great achievements. Once Ben arrived in Philadelphia, he had no money or any shelter. Because of his saving strategy that he spent his last few cents on a room for the night. Once he recuperated from his journey, he set out to find work. As he was already quite experienced, a local printer decided to have Ben run his own small printing shop. This didn't work particularly well, so he moved to another shop where he also didn't feel at home. After a couple other stints at other printing shops, one being in London, he decided to make his own shop and now a very famous newspaper called the Pennsylvania Gazette. As you probably know by now, Ben loved to save in any way possible. That's why after he printed his newspaper, he himself would deliver them in the neighborhoods. He would knock on the doors and hand them their papers. This way he was able to save money and time, as he thought he could do it much faster than someone he hired. Because of this, he started to get noticed by many people and was known as a really hard worker. After Ben got married, he started to long for an intellectual group in which they could spread their ideas and thoughts about books that they read. Unfortunately, there was no university at that time in Pennsylvania, and that's why he created the Junto Club, which is still active today. The purpose for this club was the same reason it was made. They wanted a way to discuss their books and thoughts about philosophy, science, and politics. One day, when he was at home with his family, he noticed that they were feeling really cold when the fire was still on. This prompted him to think about why was the heat escaping from our fireplace.
Ben, it's almost like there's no heat coming from the fireplace. We're just wasting heaps and heaps of wood. Yeah, I'm starting to notice that as well. I'll try and think of a solution.
He started to think about what the problem could be. After some thinking, he realized that all the heat was escaping through a hole that let the smoke go through the chimney. He created what is known today as a Franklin stove. This stove had a very small hole to ensure that only the smoke was able to get out and only a fraction of the heat was lost. It retained most of the heat. If you own a home that was built in the 60s, you might even have a later version of the Franklin stove. I do, and it gives us a lot of heat during the winter. These became pretty popular, and many homes started to switch them as they were able to save a lot of wood and they were able to keep their houses warm. Tensions with the crown are at an all-time high, and you're getting harassed by the English soldiers. People wanted a change, and they wanted an independent nation. You have to choose some people to make very big and some very important decisions. Who do you pick? Well, you pick Benjamin Franklin, of course. Because of his ingenuity, he won over the hearts of many people who would lead the nation. The nation needed to create a formal draft of independence, which is what our Independence Day is named for. On July 4th, 1776, our nation formally ratified off the Declaration of Independence, and you can bet that Benjamin Franklin's name was one of the first ones on it. Unfortunately, Britain did not want to let the United States of America have their independence peacefully, and then the War of Independence took place. As the United States was still a very, very, very young nation, they needed all the help they could get, and so they sent Ben to France to negotiate to see if France would send their soldiers and generals in a fight against Britain. He first got elected into a General Council Assembly in Philadelphia because of his hard work and the popularity that he had with the people in his town. He was able to get into this assembly because he worked as a clerk in 1736, which made him all the more welcome to get elected. Alongside of this, his contributions to the people of Philadelphia made him a prime delegate to draft the Declaration of Independence. In the colonial time period, the first few years of war were almost always the most critical ones. That's where you would get your allies or lose your allies. Ben had been sent to France by the delegation to make sure that he could recruit people from the French Republic Army. The French had a vested interest in this, as they were always trying to defeat the arch nemesis Britain.
Monsieur Franklin, I will only commit to helping the United States of America if and when you are able to win a major battle against the British. As of now, you've been getting demolished on all the fronts, and I simply cannot throw my men out there if you do not give a good result on your own.
Ben was under a significant amount of stress, as he was responsible for either bringing in an ally or losing them. On the outside, however, he tried his best to be as charming and as Benjamin-like as possible. He grew immensely popular with the French, and along with the victory at Saratoga, he was able to gain support of the King's army and a general we know today as Marquis de Lafayette. In addition to all of this, he was able to become the first ambassador to the French, and more broadly Europe as a whole. His house in France became the center of relations between the Americans and the Europeans. Soon after, Ben retired from the role of geopolitics and came back to Philadelphia, where he founded many public institutions that we take granted for today. Remember when Ben wanted books to read and he had to sneakily borrow them from the bookkeeper? Well, he founded the very first public library in the US. In addition to that, he created the very first fire station, as well as coming up with the idea of streetlights. They weren't electric, of course. And lastly, he founded the first public university in Philadelphia to make sure that people would be able to learn and discuss their ideas. The next time you visit a library, you can thank Benjamin Franklin. In this episode of The History of Something, we learned about Benjamin Franklin. We learned about his morals, his achievements, and his lasting contributions in society. We always have to remember that he did this because he loved to save, and that was his main principle. Maybe saving something will have a big impact on your life, just like our good friend, Ben Franklin.